本期视频是金刻羽2023年5月接受英国著名播客论坛的访谈节选。在这一段访谈中，他谈到稳定与和谐实际上是中国经济的指导原则，阐述了独生子女政策如何塑造了中国竞争异常激烈的经济环境，以及中国在政策调整中展现出的令人惊叹的决心和毅力。我们看看他是怎么说的吧。
We're recording on Friday, May the 12th from our studio in London, and I'm excited to introduce our guest, Keiyu Jin, who's an economist and professor at the London School of Economics. She's an advisor to the China Banking Regulatory Commission on FinTech, has advised and consulted with the World Bank and the IMF. She's born and raised in Beijing in China, but she attended high school and college in the United States, so is a rare but completely bicultural person, and we'll touch on that during the discussion. Your new book is The New China Playbook, Beyond Socialism and Capitalism, and you deal, I think, in a fascinating way with a lot of fundamental questions about how China's developing socially and economically, and I'll get onto that very quickly. But as I mentioned, you're somebody who's at home in both the US and China, and yet now there's enormous tension between those two countries. It must be a kind of difficult period for you thinking about that.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Gideon. Thanks so much for having me. Indeed, it's for me, but also for a large swath of Chinese people who have had education in the West, and to actually do work around both countries to feel extremely sad and frustrated. It's a period where, it's two countries where we see could have enormous possibility in spurring each other forward and collaboration, even competitive collaboration. But it's really sad to see the misunderstandings that have shrouded even rationality, and it's becoming increasingly dangerous to not see each other's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about it as misunderstanding, and I'm sure there's a lot of that. I worry that it could be something even worse, that it's actually a clash of interests, that these two countries, say over an issue like Taiwan, just want fundamentally different things, and that no amount of discussion is going to talk that away.
There are many people feel that there's almost very little hope because the two countries have two different worldviews, different political systems, and different value systems. And even with economic convergence, there has been very little convergence elsewhere. But we also have to remember that this is a vicious circle to believe that nothing can be worked out, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we must do utmost to avoid that. But we have to look at the practicalities, the economic issues, the substantive issues, because frankly, the two economies are in their worst state of economy for various reasons, as well as is the rest of the world. But there could be things to be done.
And I mean, it's interesting also because the histories of the two countries have become, certainly the economic histories, are so tightly bound together over the last 40 years. I mean, I doubt the rise of China would have been nearly as rapid without the opening of the American market, but also the American economy has been transformed by the way in which its cooperation with China.
We also often forget that China is no longer an exporter of cheap furniture and toys, but actually a main exporter and importer of intermediate products, which accounts for 2/3 of global trade. We just don't see that. But these intermediate products makes companies more profitable, makes companies more productive. The likes of Apple, the likes of Western companies and Chinese companies. There's a lot of things that are not in the headline news that are just as important. We're talking about trillions of dollars at stake with economic disengagement between a $15 trillion and a $21 trillion economy.
Well, we'll get back to disengagement at some point later, but I'd like to go back to, if you like, the beginning, the opening of China, because as you make clear in your book, you were of the generation that grew up when China was still poor. Your family experienced rationing, and you've seen this incredible transformation. Just give me a sense of what's happened over the course of your lifetime and what you witnessed.
In the early 1980s, we lived in communal kitchens and or let me start again. In the 1980s, we lived on rationed food and cooked from communal kitchens, and even 11 square meter apartments were considered a luxury. And I remember reading poems with my father under candlelight, 3 nights of blackouts every week in Beijing. And fast forward, now my classmates have, houses and computers and cars, and they've seen everything. It's a big transformation. But for me personally, to have come to the West when I was a teenager and to see that the first thing they asked me was just, just about, the political issues around China. But then a few years later in college, people were learning Chinese. They were going to China, for American students, by the way, to seek jobs, to seek opportunities. All of that within 10, 15 years, an enormous, amazing transformation.
And there's a fascinating chapter in your book about them being also the generation marked by the one-child policy, and which I think comes in more or less at the same time as Deng Xiaoping opens up the economy. And I think you said in your book that in your school class, like everybody was a single child.
There was one exception. A Uyghur classmate of mine had a sibling.
But other than that, 40 kids, all single.
Absolutely.
Have you been able to, I guess because everyone's like that, it's hard to assess what the psychological impact of that is. But although you talk about it a bit, and it seems to me a combination of intense pressure and also perhaps a sense of entitlement.
I think that people underestimate or don't fully understand the profound social and economic consequences the one-child policy has played on China and, frankly, the rest of the world. This generation is highly educated, but also grew up in super competition, overburdened, very lonely. I mean, don't forget the Chinese are the inventors. This generation are the inventors of the only singles day in the world, a day in which they splurge and borrow, and Alibaba gets to process 500,000 orders per second. At the same time, they have obligations to their parents who now only have one child. And so they have to face, as the Chinese people in general have to balance between deference to authority, at the same time, their free-willed, independent thinking and that education that has empowered them. It's always a balancing act. So they have a unique set of problems. And of course, now with the rising housing prices, can they afford to have a bigger family? And they have shown in the statistic that they don't want to get married anymore and they don't want to have as many children. All of these are social consequences, somewhat related to the one-child policy.
And of course, the government has now reversed the one-child policy. But from what you're saying, there may be an irreversible social change already in train.
The habit of having no siblings, small families, is one thing. I think the government is desperately trying through a variety of factors, including cracking down the education system and even coming up with very creative ways to encourage single women to have children, something that is radical considering such a traditional culture and society, and including the real estate, reigning in the real estate sector, all has somewhat to do with the new generation. But the fact is, 25% of college students last year didn't get a job. The high youth unemployment rate of 20% above, a big gap of between expectations and reality of not fulfilling their dreams are all a present challenge for the Chinese government.
Yeah, and that's a stunning statistic because, if I just think about it from first principles, here you've got this economy that's been growing at an incredible pace for the last 40 years. A very small rising generation because it's a one-child generation, and yet you say 20% of graduates are unemployed. How can that be?
It's interesting that there are 30 million manufacturing jobs that need to be filled and that can't be filled by 2025. And in high-tech sectors like semiconductors, there are 300,000 vacancies this year. This shows you that the present problem is not that there are not enough jobs, but there's a big gap in terms of education and skill. Now, these Chinese students, very smart and very, very educated, very well educated and impressive. However, they don't have internships. Many of them don't show the kind of business acumen and flexibility, mental flexibility, because they have been overburdened by a competitive test-taking, rote memorization kind of education system. So they're not that appealing to the private businesses that demand passion, interest, ethics, and some experience. So I think that there are lots of things to fix, and they will be a positive force for the new generation, but the whole economy has to change somewhat.
Yeah, but there's an interesting, again, anecdote in the book where you say that there was a cigarette-making plant where the people assembling the cigarettes were all graduates, and some of them postgraduates on that line.
top masters and college students in cigarette factories, nannies that have master degrees from Columbia. These are all things that have caused a social uproar. You got to ask, the Chinese families, what is it all about? Their hope, right? It's all about the next generation. For a long period of time, the bottom run of society was happy and content because they knew that their children could have a better future. That's what sustained. That was the bedrock to social stability. Today, it's a completely different issue with reduced expectations that even if you poor and about 25% of household expenditure are devoted to educating one child, if you are investing that much resources, in the end, your kid doesn't get a good job, then what is your hope? How are you going to look into the future?
And the kid itself must feel horribly demoralized because all the family's hopes are poured into them and then perhaps through no fault of your own, you haven't delivered.
There's a new phenomenon called lying flat, basically giving up. Now, that's become a focal point for the Chinese leaders. They don't think that this is something that should be encouraged. But, I want to take a different perspective on this. Lying flat is not about being utterly disgruntled and giving up per se. It's also come to characterize a part of the new generation that is more relaxed, that's less ambitious, that is less hungry. Now, don't forget that when China joined the WTO, one of the core reasons
why... That's in 2001.
That was in 2001 when it was so successful was not because of the subsidies, but because there was a large swath of really productive and super hard-working labor force where the Foxconn workers opted for 3 shifts a night. That generation is gone. That's not the current generation of new workers. So we want to think about China's new generation as having a better lifestyle, life consumption balance, and work-life balance, and have a different vision, different perspective. They're not going to compete and race for the bottom. And that kind of job is going to be passed on to other countries. It's always a cycle of renewal. So there are a variety of things that the Chinese government is doing. For instance, expanding the capacity and quality of vocational schools. The gap in manufacturing, as I spoke about, is because China is primarily still a manufacturing-based economy. So they want to educate and equip these students, the new generation, with the right skill set to fill that gap. They are expanding the service sector, where many of these highly educated people can be absorbed more than manufacturing sectors. So and even the common prosperity policies, which includes, trying to crack down on technology and education sectors. Of course, it was unfortunately implemented and had severe consequences on the economy. But by design and intention, they were trying to make the society more harmonious, less competitive.
This is where they said, they almost overnight said, private tutoring illegal. And that why was that done? Because they felt too much money and too much pressure on people.
Too much pressure on the kids, overburdened by tutorials. It's a race to the bottom because everybody spends to have more tutorials, and that doesn't get you anywhere.
Just give me a picture of the kind of social life that involved for the children involved. What was going on?
They have the busiest schedule of everybody. Saturdays and Sundays packed with 5 classes a day and tutorials even after classes during the weekday. Even people from the working class are sending their kids to tutorials, really spending a lot of money. But to what effect? In the end, it's all the same. It's all just test taking.
Yeah. And so overnight, the government said, OK, this is going to stop.
There were also, exploitative motivations of these private tutorial companies. So I think the intention is not a wrong one, but you basically killed a part of the industry overnight. And these kind of dramatic moves we often find so radical in the Chinese government. Sometimes they're first of all meant to make a big point to signal, and then they're gradually rolled back. So it's a process of constant recalibration and fine-tuning, and the pendulum often swings, but it's often very dramatic in the beginning.
Yeah, but it also tells you something about how dramatically the Chinese government's way of operation differs from, say, a standard Western government. I can't imagine the UK government saying overnight, OK, no more private tutoring, that's it. Couldn't be done, really.
The Western governments have argued for a long time about regulating big tech, regulating AI, and little is done. China, for all what you disagree with, their implementation procedures can move quickly once they've made up their mind. So there's pros and cons of both.